my family and I, we were driving home the other night, and we couldn't help but to notice this moon. It was larger than usual, but it was just a crescent. It was this fine little crescent moon, and you could see like the fullness of the moon, like the outline of the moon. And you can't always see that, at least I can't always see that, but this time you could see the fullness of the moon, but just this little sliver was lit up. But because it was big, I don't know why it was so large, but because it was so big, that little sliver still was able to emanate enough light to glimmer over the water. We were driving home on Coast Highway and over the Pacific Ocean, seeing this crescent moon just barely giving a glimmer over that water was just something to see. And we started talking about it. My wife and 2 kids were in the car and just making some general comments about the moon that everybody pretty much knows, but might be cool to an 8 and 10-year-old riding along with us, that, the moon actually doesn't have any light of its own. That little sliver that we see, that's just a little bit of the sun that we're seeing reflected. And why does the moon get bigger and smaller, and why does it wane and wax and comes into fullness and goes away to nothing, seemingly? And just having this conversation with my kids about the moon, and all of this just continued to just bring more nuance and depth and layer. When I woke up the next morning and in my meditation, this image of the moon comes back again, and I just started replaying the conversation that we were having in the car about the moon and its cycles and the things that we were noticing, just how those correlate into our life, into my life. And I felt like I wanted to just make a video to just share some of those, if anything at all, to document them for myself. And you may appreciate some of the reflections as well. But one of the things that I noticed, about the moon is that whenever it wanes and waxes, it comes into a full moon, and then it comes into a new moon. And when we were driving, I thought it was peculiar, and so I shared it, that, isn't it interesting that we don't call it an empty moon? I mean, wouldn't that be the natural opposite of a full moon? Would be an empty moon. And it looks empty, I mean, if you're going stargazing, like, you don't want the full moon, you want an empty sky to go look at all the beautiful stars. But it's full moon and new moon, and it began to spark ideas in my own self about whenever I feel quite empty and whenever I feel like there's nothing happening, and whenever I feel hopeless and in despair, and that void that I experience. But just like the moon, it's not empty at all. It actually is fully there. You just can't see it. There's just no light emanating from it in that moment. But its essence is still fully there, fully intact, ready, willing, waiting for its moment to be a reflection of the light. And that's why we don't call it an empty moon, because it is still fully there. I started to just think about my own life in those seasons of time whenever it feels so empty, that it's actually something new that's emerging. There's a new cycle. And in the same way, we don't even give the moon freedom to go through its cycles. We just know the moon goes through its cycles. There's no question about this. Again, this is something that we see in the sky so often, and we don't even really notice it, until we really notice it. And just seeing that if I can expect that in nature, then maybe I can give myself the freedom to expect that for me too. If I'm a part of this whole thing, if I'm not separate from this whole thing, if I am in union with all things and everything is showing me reflections of the truth of who I am in my lived experience, then those empty moments aren't quite empty. They're just cycles. It's the empty slate, it's the empty canvas for something new to wane into existence through my life. And this has brought me a whole lot of peace because, it can be quite despairing and discouraging whenever it feels like things are empty and not happening and that there's no light emanating from you. But there's a deep hope in trusting the cycle. In the cliche way, we would say this is trusting the process. And then that got me thinking more so too that the moon doesn't emanate any light of itself, that it is only a reflection. It's a mirror of the great light, the eternal light, the sun that never turns off, right? This fully radiant sun that's just bringing its rays of radiance to the moon that's then being reflected to us here on Earth. And thinking again, in terms of my own self, that the moon is just being the moon. It is not making decisions about how much, or how less light it is to radiate. It's simply being the moon through its cycles. In the positioning that it goes through, it naturally radiates that amount of sunlight, creating our crescent moons, coming into the fullness, going through its lunar cycle. And that's really our job in life, is to remain open, to remain faithful through all of our cycles so that we can be the reflection that we're supposed to be in the proper time of the cycle. Imagine if the moon had somehow had consciousness, go with me here for a moment, and was able to make the decision to just be full all the time. Everything would be disrupted in the natural order of our Earth. But rather, if it's faithful, if you will, again, if it had consciousness, if it was just faithful to its cycles, it would not complain when it has less light emanating from it, because it knows that it's part of the process. This is how it goes. And so, in that space of surrender, in that space of openness or even emptiness, it can become full in its cycle and then wane and wax and do all of its things in faithfulness to what it's designed to be and to do. And it relies on the power of the sun. That within itself there is nothing. There is no power within itself. The only power and light that it has to give us is only that is reflected from a source beyond it. And in the same way, we don't have any power within ourselves. We are completely reliant and dependent on the great source that wants to shine in us and through us and as us in this world. And who are we to be frustrated or discouraged when more or less light is perceivingly being shown as us and our reflections? Who are we to judge the magnitude or the beauty or the purpose or the meaning of the light that is or is not shining through us? And as I started to just meditate on surrender from all of this and being grateful to God, or in this analogy to the sun for its radiance, to God for its radiance and its spirit that flows through me, flows through each of us, just began to shift from meditation into the prayer of God, may I be open and empty and non-judging of the light that you want to shine through the cycles of life. May I remain in that space of willingness to serve as much or as little radiance without any sort of judgment or manipulation on what I think. Because we're all playing a part in a bigger role here. There is a bigger thing at play here, and we are all a part of it. But we have to surrender to the flow, the natural flow of our life, and trust the cycle. Trust the light source. Trust that all things are in perfect divine timing, in the right way. And so as I noticed this moon and the crescent of it, and again, how beautiful is the crescent moon? And it's so little light that's coming. Most of the month is filled with the moon not at full capacity and not at the new state. Most of the month is filled with partial light. And it's beautiful. So maybe those moments in your life when you're at that full capacity, sure, it's bright and it's incredible, but most of our life is going to be lived in partial light. And that's just as beautiful. And sometimes we'll go through a cycle, a part of the cycle where there's no light. And you know what? That's beautiful too. Because it's not empty, it's new. And there's a deep hope in that. So these are just some rambling reflections that I had from my drive home the other night, and hopefully an encouragement. It's been an encouragement to myself of trusting the cycle, trusting the light, and just being a empty vessel for whatever the divine wants to do in and through and as my life. And my encouragement, friend, is that you remain open and empty too, knowing that that emptiness is not the kind of void emptiness that has no meaning, but rather it's the open hand that is able to participate in whatever way God is moving in and through you, and using you as a vehicle and an instrument for the ongoing healing of the world. In whatever process that's taking place in, with whatever people that you find yourself with. So remain open to be the light